Madam President.
The senator from Kansas.
Mr. Acting Presiding Officer, I think I said Madam President. I've been thinking of my relationship with the distinguished senator from Michigan and our work on the Agriculture Committee. I apologize.
The senator from Kansas is recognized.
Mr. President, I asked to speak as if in morning business for approximately 20 minutes, and I probably won't use all that. I will yield time back.
Without objection, the senator is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to speak again about the President Obama's January 18th executive order. And that order directed agencies, all federal agencies within the administration, to review or repeal those significant regulatory actions that are duplicative, overly burdensome, or would have a significant economic impact on ordinary Americans. The President went on to say, I'm paraphrasing from his words, they are costly, they are duplicative, in many cases they are necessary, we need to review them, and in some cases, actually, they're stupid. Now, that's a direct quote from the President. I'm paraphrasing, but he did say the word stupid. Probably stupid would be the word, or maybe egregious, or maybe fed up, in almost any group or any organization back home that you would visit with. I know senators in their past break or our work period, if you will, probably spoke to a lot of groups. I'll tell you what happens to me. I walk into a group, any organization, be farmers, ranchers, educators, healthcare, whatever, and they say, Pat, what on earth are you doing back there passing all these regulations, a wave of regulations that do not make common sense and do not fit the yardstick, if you will, of cost and benefit. And we can't even wake up any morning without some new regulation popping across the desk, and we just don't have the people to do this, and you're about to put us out of business. Well, first thing I say, I'm not a you guy, I'm an us guy, and I'm very much aware of these regulations. We have to do something about it, and I brought up the fact that the President himself recognized these problems. But I have to say that while I applauded this decision by the President, I noted that there were some loopholes in his executive order, and they're roughly about these, if I could just sort of summarize them. Number one, if you're doing something for the public good, and obviously the Secretary of any agency is going to say, well, sure, we're doing something for the public good, well, then you're exempt. That's a pretty big loophole to drive the truck through. And then secondly, if you're an independent agency, well, let's try the IRS. And I think more people than most would say, yeah, we have some regulatory problems with the IRS, several more. I won't go into those. And then you have this paragraph here that I'm going to read that the agencies can apply to the decision as whether or not they're going to review the regulations they have on the books and regulations coming down the pike. And they can apply this to it to see if they're exempt. In applying these principles, each agency is directed to use the best available techniques, this is within the executive order, to quantify anticipated present and future benefits and costs as accurately as possible. I can't imagine anybody being opposed to that. But where appropriate and permitted by law, each agency may consider and discuss qualitatively, that's the yardstick, values that are difficult or impossible to quantify. I don't know how you do that, including equity, human dignity, fairness, and distributive impacts. That's about as amorphous language that I can possibly put together. I don't know of anybody, any secretary or anybody in any agency that promulgate all the regulations that they think they are forced to under some congressional act or perhaps executive order that they're trying to issue. If they apply this, of course they're exempt. So you got loopholes, again, that you can drive trucks through in regards to the fact that this basically, this executive order is not going to be adhered to, because everybody's going to stand up and say, we're exempt, we're doing public good, and we're doing this language here, whatever that means. And so while I applaud the decision by the President, I decided I would introduce legislation last week to strengthen and codify his executive order. All that means is we codify it, we say, okay, the executive order stands, sorry, no exemptions. What a day that would bring to Washington, with all the federal agencies saying, whoa, stop. We're going to take a look at all the regulations that we have out there now, and we're going to take a look at all the ones that we are promulgating, which are hundreds of them. And I might note there were 44 major regulatory decisions that cost the American business community $27 billion, according to one study, just last year. And we're finding so more and more people coming to Washington and have an agenda in regards to these regulations, and somewhere the folks out there that are being impacted seem to be overlooked. I have 30, 32, 35 co-sponsors on this bill. I ask on both sides of the aisle for co-sponsors. I think it's a good bill. It would be a brand new day in Washington if every federal agency had to stop and say, well, wait a minute, let's apply a cost-benefit yardstick, and the executive order sort of goes into that as to what that would mean. And they have one individual that's supposed to be doing all of this, so they could report to him, although that would be, you know, quite a load. My goodness, if all the federal agencies in Washington stopped and said, whoa, and stopped their regulatory process, there would be a cheer out in the hinterland in regards to every business I can think of. Well, as the administration moves forward with this review, I'm going to have something to say in several areas, one health care, one energy, one financial legislation, or financing the people who are lending agencies and the effect of the regulatory reform. But today I want to talk about agriculture. And today I want to talk about the EPA and what's going on in regards to what I think is regulatory overkill for sure. Basically, as the administration moved forward with its review, I recommended the President and his advisors pay particularly close attention to the activities of three specific agencies when they are determining which proposed regulations will place the greatest burden on agriculture. I am privileged to be the ranking Republican and to serve with the Senator from Michigan, our co-chairman of the committee, Deborah Stabenow. A key component of our nation's economy, I'm talking about agriculture now, and the ability to feed this country in a troubled and hungry world. And we're talking about the agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Agriculture, and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, all impacting agriculture. Since fiscal year 2010, 10 new regulations promulgated, that's a fancy word in Washington to say issued, the regulations, by the EPA have accounted for over $23 billion in new costs to the American taxpayer. That's outrageous, and they're just getting started. The EPA has several new proposals, many of which will have immediate negative impacts on the ability of America's farmers and ranchers to continue to produce enough food to feed our communities, our states, our country, and yes, the world. And think of how valuable that is as we look down the road with about 9.3 billion increase in population compared to 6 billion today. We're going to have to double agriculture production. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Why on earth would we want to be doing anything to the farmer and rancher whose job it is to do that? That's beyond me. I'm going to highlight two such proposals that many producers have brought to my attention. I just addressed the Commodity Classic in Kansas, and a great band, about 200 farmers attended. Guess what their number one concern was? Over-regulation. Regulation that could put them out of business. Oh, they're concerned about the Farm Bill. They're concerned about lending. They're concerned about debt. But first, in only 7 short weeks, the EPA will require farmers who are applying pesticide to kill pests so they can save the crop to obtain a permit under the Clean Water Act, even though that activity is already highly regulated under the federal pesticide law. The President said we don't need regulations that are duplicative. We don't need 2 agencies having a different agreement on one regulation. Probably don't even need that regulation because we have very strong regulations under the FIFRA Act that we have right now. Farmers and other pesticide applicators would, under this regulatory impact would not be facing these requirements if the administration had chosen to vigorously defend its longstanding policy that protections, excuse me, Mr. President, had chosen to vigorously defend its longstanding policy that protections under the federal pesticide law were sufficient to protect the environment. That's probably a phone call from some farmer who's listening to this and say, go ahead, give him you know what, Pat. Unfortunately, the administration chose a different path, and now estimates suggest that this duplicative regulation will require 365,000 individuals to get a Clean Water Act permit. 365,000 individuals. A requirement that will cost $50 million and require 1 million hours per year to implement, and bottom line, will not add any environmental protection. This layer of red tape will place a huge financial burden on the shoulders of farm families all across the country, as well as state governments responsible for enforcement, while at the same time facing dire budget situations. Last month, John Salazar, a former member of the House of Representatives and newly appointed Colorado Commissioner of Agriculture, stated in his testimony before the House, quote, "It is no secret that states across the country face dire budget situations. Many have had to close state parks, cancel transportation projects, and cut funding to higher education. It is very difficult," said John Salazar from Colorado, "to justify diverting even more resources to manage paperwork for a permit that is duplicative of other regulatory programs and has no appreciable environmental benefits. However, if Colorado's estimates are reflective of the situation in other states, the true cost to states will quickly outstrip EPA's estimates. More than 365,000 individuals, $50 million and 1 million hours per year to implement on the backs of our farmers and ranchers. Mr. President, these expenses are not just limited to the cost of compliance and enforcement. The April 9th effective date is near. There is still significant confusion and uncertainty about what pesticide applications will fall under these new regulations. This means that farmers and other pesticide applicators may very well find themselves subject to massive penalties. On top of the fact that they shouldn't be filling the paperwork out in the first place, if they don't, they could be held responsible for massive penalties for minor paperwork violations to the tune of, get this, $37,500 per day per violation. Unbelievable. Beyond agency enforcement, they will also now be exposed to the threat of litigation under the Clean Water Citizens Suit provisions. With the volatile nature of agriculture markets and increased demand, these sort of risks and resulting costs are something that producers and the hungry mouths who depend on them simply cannot afford. Next, EPA is undertaking an effort to control particulate matter, this is a favorite of mine, otherwise known as dust. They call it rural fugitive dust. This is a dust-off the old 1970s effort to control rural fugitive dust. I remember that. Somebody must have pulled it from the file. This is part of the EPA's review of the PM standard under the Clean Air Act. The agency is currently considering the most stringent regulations on farm dust that have ever been proposed. I finally reached back when they first proposed this, the person that was in charge of promoting, or she was going to promulgate these regulations on rural fugitive dust. And before I could get a word in, finally I reached the person who was in charge. It took me 3 days. And finally, before I could get a word in, she says, "Do you realize," at that point I was a congressman, and she said, "Do you realize, Mr. Roberts, that you have a lot of dust out in your country?" I said, "No kidding. I think I think we know that. That's why we have the Great Plains Conservation Program. That's what we have. Each farmer has to have a conservation program if they're going to apply or be applicable to the Farm Bill. And we have the Conservation Reserve Program. We're doing everything we can to control dust, rest assured. Nobody likes that. And I said, what would you have us do to comply with rural fugitive dust? He says, well, you know, those grain trucks at harvest, they go up and down gravel roads and they cause a lot of dust. No kidding. And I said, what would you have us do? Well, why don't you send water trucks out at 10 o'clock in the morning and 2 in the afternoon to every community in Kansas that has all those gravel roads where you harvest wheat? I said, great idea. That would be marvelous. Maybe we could get a grant. Today that would be a stimulus grant to small communities in regards to rural areas where we're doing the wheat harvest to, number one, buy the trucks, number two, find the water. Now, that's just how ridiculous this is with rural fugitive dust. To put it simply, this defies common sense. Whether there's cattle kicking up dust in a feedlot in Dodge City, Kansas, or Larned, Kansas, or anywhere in Kansas during harvest, on a hot afternoon on the high plains in June, dust is a naturally occurring event. Standards beyond the current limit would be impossible to meet, particularly in the western portion of the nation where rainfall is often scarce. I don't even know why I'm taking this seriously in regards to that kind of a regulation. In a bipartisan June letter, 23 members of this body wrote a letter to express these concerns to Administrator Jackson, and we said this: considering the administration's focus on rural America and rural economic development, a proposal such as this would have a negative effect on those very goals. Common sense requires the EPA to acknowledge that wind blows and so does dust. Now, as we think about EPA's actions impacting agriculture, it is critical to recognize that no one cares more about maintaining a clean environment than the American farmer and rancher. Our producers across the country manage their operations responsibly because of their desire to keep farming and to one day pass along that ranch or field to their sons or daughters or grandchildren if they can. They know firsthand that clean air and water and healthy soil go hand in hand with a healthy economy. Our producers deserve respect and appreciation from EPA, not costly and redundant and unnecessary and, yes, even ridiculous regulation. Let's shift departments now. The Department of Agriculture's Grain Inspection, Packers, and Stockyards Administration, that's tough, that's called GIPSA, by the way, that's the acronym. Agriculture's Grain Inspection, Packers, and Stockyards Administration released a proposed rule that would dramatically increase the red tape governing the business relationships surrounding the production and marketing of livestock in the United States. The rule was initially proposed last summer without, Mr. President, the benefit of a meaningful cost-benefit analysis, something we've been trying to get in my legislation, something the executive order should have done. However, the proposal has since received significant criticism from ranchers, industry, members of the Congress alike, now being further evaluated by USDA officials. As written, the proposal would dramatically reduce the consumer's choice. It would increase cost. The proposal exposes packers to liability for use of alternative marketing arrangements and other innovative procurement methods, thereby ultimately depressing the prices received for America's most efficient and successful producers while potentially reducing the quality available to consumers. Further, this proposed rule would actually increase the concentration in the sector as businesses are forced to change their current organizational structure, and you would find an exacerbation of the very issue the rule is allegedly designed to address. Now, for instance, in Kansas, we have a highly successful rancher-owned company made up of individual producers. They own both cattle and shares in the company's processing infrastructure. Under this proposal, many of the individuals of the company may now be prohibited from selling cattle directly to other processors, creating the need for a middleman that would then lower the price the producer would actually receive. If implemented, this so-called GIPSA rule poses a substantial threat to the continued viability of the domestic livestock sector. Now, in Kansas, this industry contributes over $9.5 billion to our economy just in Kansas. With an economic footprint of this magnitude, the GIPSA regulation is a burden that Kansas and many other rural states, many other livestock producers simply can't afford. Let me talk about another agency falling through the President's executive order loophole, and that's the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. As a result of the Dodd-Frank Act, the Regulatory Reform Act in the financial world, the CFTC is charged with developing dozens of new regulations impacting participants up and down what's called the swaps and futures chain. Now, shouldn't these regulations be held to the same standard of cost-effectiveness and undue burden as others? Well, yes, but no. I talked to Chairman Gansler in my office just a couple of days ago. Very nice man, very pleasant. He believes very strongly that the CFTC is exempt from the President's executive order because Congress said it was exempt. I indicated I didn't think so, especially since the CFTC is currently pushing 40-plus rules out the door 1 year with little or no priority. We were told the intent of Dodd-Frank was to reduce systemic risk in the financial marketplace. However, several of CFTC's proposals appear to increase risk management costs on those who do not pose a systemic threat. Now, the CFTC must be mindful that increased costs through high margin and capital requirements on certain segments of the marketplace may decrease a user's ability to use appropriate risk management tools. A rigorous cost-benefit analysis tailor-made for the CFTC's current situation, dozens of economically significant rules, the potential to negatively impact risk management costs of American businesses, and a simple question needing to be answered. Do the benefits of this proposed regulation, and we're talking about anywhere from 40 to 60 now, in the form of lower systemic risk in our financial system, outweigh the increased cost on businesses? Let me just say something in talking with Chairman Gansler, and again, I really appreciate him coming by the office and talking, and it became obvious to me that with all these regulations, maybe the first one ought to be a definition regulation. What is a swap? Who is a dealer? Hasn't been done yet. So we're going to propose 40 or 39 more regulations, and we haven't even defined who the regulations will affect and what is the subject matter that they're going to regulate. That's really unbelievable. We're going to have a hearing tomorrow in the Senate Agriculture Committee. Mr. Gansler, Chairman Gansler, will attend, will give his testimony. We're going to be very welcoming him in regards to the committee, but that's something I'm going to answer. Why on earth are you going ahead with 40 regulations and you can't even define who you're going to regulate and what you're going to regulate? No definition. That to me is pretty bad. You got the cart before the horse there. Mr. President, in closing, I want to make 2 points. First, in many rural areas of Kansas and the rest of the country, agriculture is the cornerstone of the economy. Second, in the coming decades, we will be even more reliant on America's farmers and ranchers to feed an ever-growing world population. I said that before. We must truly commit to a real and robust, here's a good Senate word, robust review and revocation of any and all unduly burdensome regulations that could inhibit American agriculture's ability to produce the safest, most abundant, and affordable food, feed, and fiber supply in the world. What are we talking about? 9.3 billion people. What are we talking about? The ability for our agriculture, everybody in agriculture, to double our production, all the farmers and ranchers. Why on earth would we want this whole business of regulatory impact, most of which is highly questionable, none of which fits the President's executive order to take a look at a cost-benefit? Why on earth would we do this to the very person whose job it is to feed this country in a troubled world and hungry world? Look at the Mideast, in turmoil. Remember that one interview on TV where somebody stuck a microphone and asked one of the protesters in Libya, "What are you protesting for? Democracy?" He says, "No, loaf of bread." Where people are hungry and malnourished, you have no economic opportunity, and you have people who are hungry and they will go and join extremist groups and even on over into terrorism groups. I had the privilege of being the chairman of the Intelligence Committee here in the Senate, and that was one of the big considerations we had in whole areas of the world where people do not have the ability to feed themselves, and they're in a food-deficient area, and it really poses problems for the future of that part of the world. And here yet, we ask our farmers and ranchers to double our ag production in a couple of decades. I don't know how we're going to do this with this regulatory nightmare. Let's hope we wake up soon. And I would hope everybody take a good look at my bill to codify the President's executive order. Give him credit for doing that, but not with all these loopholes which are going to drive us nuts out there in rural and small-town America. I yield back, Mr. President. Thank you. In the absence of a quorum.
Poll of the Senate.
Mr. Akaka.
Today is someone who has practiced medicine in Wyoming for, may I ask the quorum call be vitiated?
Without objection, the senator from
Thank you,
Wyoming
Mr.
is
President.
recognized.
Mr. President, I come to ask to speak, is this in morning business?
Without objection, the senator
Thank
is
you.
recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the floor today as someone who has practiced medicine in Wyoming, taking care of families there for a quarter of a century, working with people from all across our great state, as a physician who has also served in our state Senate, and both in my practice as well as in my service in the state Senate, I've dealt with the issue of Medicaid, a program that is set up to help low-income Americans obtain health care. So I come today with a doctor's second opinion about recent developments and findings with regard to the health care law, because day after day, Mr. President, we see news reports showing states all across the country facing extreme financial budget pressures, even bankruptcy. And one of the key factors exacerbating state fiscal troubles is the Medicaid program. Well, Mr. President, over the next 10 years, Washington will spend about $4.4 trillion on Medicaid. And at the state level, Medicaid spending now consumes roughly 1/4 of the budgets of each of the states. Now, increasing Medicaid costs often force governors and state legislators to make drastic cuts to local priorities, such as education, law enforcement, public safety. And as I mentioned, I did serve in the Wyoming State Legislature, 5 years in the Wyoming State Senate. I was there last week to address the legislature, the Senate and the House in Wyoming, to talk with them, listen to them about their concerns. And in the state of Wyoming, we are required on an annual basis to balance our budget. We do it every year. So I know from a firsthand experience that tough choices need to be made. And that is why I can tell you that this current health care law, President Obama's health care law, is not going to make it any easier for our states to close the budget gaps that they are facing. And as a matter of fact, Mr. President, it is going to make the situation worse. The President's health care law created the biggest Medicaid expansion in history. The law says that every state must provide Medicaid for every one of their citizens who earns up to 133% of the federal poverty level. This doesn't work for the states, and it doesn't work for the people who will be forced onto Medicaid. The health care law does not provide the additional resources to states that are already strapped for cash in order to try to deal with paying for this incredible expansion of Medicaid. And it certainly doesn't give states the additional financial help so that they can pay health care providers enough to participate in Medicaid. Because you know, Mr. President, about 40% of physicians across the country refuse to see Medicaid patients. My partners and I took care of everyone in Wyoming who would call or come to our office, regardless of ability to pay, but across the country, about 40% of physicians refuse to see Medicaid patients. So I've said over and over throughout this health care reform debate over the last year or so that having a health care government insurance card doesn't mean someone will automatically have access to medical care. The President frequently talks about making sure people have coverage, but that does not necessarily mean they will have access to care. So I want to be very clear, Mr. President. The states, especially my home state of Wyoming, do an incredible job of running the Medicaid program. They do it with limited resources. But a weak economy combined with a high unemployment rate drove Medicaid enrollment to record levels. So it isn't a surprise that Medicaid is quickly consuming greater and greater portions of state budgets, cutting into money that's being used to pay for teachers, for police, and for firefighters. You know, former Governor Phil Bredesen of Tennessee, Democrat, I think he said it best when he called the health care law's Medicaid expansion the mother of all unfunded mandates. Governor Bredesen went on to say that, quote, Medicaid is a poor vehicle for expanding coverage. Let me repeat that. Medicaid, which the President has used as the approach to expand coverage, the governor, the Democratic governor, says Medicaid is a poor vehicle for expanding coverage. He went on to say it's a 45-year-old system originally designed for poor women and their children. It's not health care reform to dump more money into Medicaid. Well, the former governor of Tennessee isn't alone. On November 9th of 2010, Governor Brian Schweitzer of my neighboring state of Montana, also a Democrat, met with his state's health industry leaders to talk about Medicaid, the challenges that they're facing. What he said was, quote, as the manager of Montana's budget, he said, "I am worried because there are only 3 states that will increase the number of people on Medicaid at a faster rate than Montana, thanks to the new health care bill." He said, "My job is to try and find ways to go forward that Montana can continue to fund Medicaid and not be like 48 other states." And then he said, broke. So in January, 33 governors and governors-elect sent a letter to President Obama, to congressional leadership, and to Health and Human Service Secretary Sebelius. What did they say? Well, the letter asks federal lawmakers to lift the constraints placed on them by the health care law's mandates. The governors are begging Congress for help. They each have very unique Medicaid programs across the country, the different states, and they need the flexibility to manage their programs, their individual programs, as effectively and efficiently as possible. Well, they all need to make tough but necessary budget decisions. And they can't do it when Washington bureaucrats, in the enduring wisdom of those in Washington, won't allow it. If you want to add insult to injury, this week the President claimed, as he was addressing governors at the National Governor Association, claimed that the health care law offers states flexibility to create their own health care plans. This was Monday. In an address to the National Governors Association, the President made an announcement. He announced, quote, "If your state can create a plan that covers as many people as affordably and comprehensively as the Affordable Care Act does, without increasing the deficit," he said, "you can implement that plan." Well, that's quite a tall and almost impossible order, Mr. President. The American people, and certainly the governors who were listening to him in the audience on Monday, saw right through the President's PR stunt. The President's plan requires states to create health care plans that imitate his health care law, rather than actually offering states true freedom to innovate better solutions. And there are better solutions out there, Mr. President, than what this body and the House of Representatives passed and the President signed into law almost a year ago. It seems to me the President wants to have his cake and eat it too. He tells the states that they already have the ability to craft a different health care plan, but of course there is a catch. What the President doesn't say, what he wouldn't tell the governors, is that states can only design different health care plans if and only if they meet the health care law's litany of Washington mandates. States still must pass legislation mandating all of its citizens buy health insurance. States must still provide Washington-approved insurance coverage. Washington levels, Washington-approved. Limiting use of innovative health care products like health savings accounts. Oh, no, that's not allowed by the President. States are still locked into the law's Medicaid expansion spending requirements. So, Mr. President, during these tough economic times, the states need certainty. They need consistency, not more Washington doublespeak. Last month, I introduced, along with Senator Lindsey Graham, a bill giving the states exactly what they need: flexibility, freedom, and choice. The bill is called the State Health Care Choice Act, and this legislation is simple, it is straightforward, and it protects states' rights by allowing them to voluntarily opt out of portions of the health care law. Specifically, our bill offers states the chance to opt out of the law's individual mandate, to opt out of the law's employer mandate and penalties, to opt out of the Medicaid expansion, and to opt out of the insurance benefit mandates. Why should the federal government, why should Washington force the states to adopt a one-size-fits-all health care plan? States can decide what works best for them. They need to be able to act on those decisions. They don't need Washington to tell them what to do. Well, some of the most innovative health care policy ideas truly do originate at the state and the local level. Governors, state legislators, state insurance commissioners, they each have much greater insight into what works for their citizens and what does not. States are feeling trapped by the new health care law's mandates. My bill, the one along with Lindsey Graham, gives the states the sovereignty to pursue their own reform ideas and approaches. Each state deserves the right. Let me repeat that. Each state deserves the right to pursue health care reforms that they think actually help the citizens of their state. The states have always been the laboratories of democracy, the laboratory to test good ideas. Unfortunately, this health care law locks them into a one-size-fits-all approach. The states want their freedom. The states deserve their freedom. Our bill gives it to them, offering the flexibility needed to generate better health care reform solutions. Solutions that do not require the states to follow a Washington plan that may ultimately leave them broke. In writing the State Health Care Choice Act, I started with the assumption that people generally can be trusted to do the right thing, and society prospers when government has less to say about how people run their lives. Others, many in this body, start by assuming that Washington knows best and should take more authority over everyone else. Well, Mr. President, the states, the American people, are telling us that they want health care reform, but they are telling us loud and clear that they do not want this health care law. So it is time to give the states the autonomy to create health care systems that work best for them, and we do not have to dismantle the nation's current health care system, build it up in the image of big government, shift costs to the states, add billions to our national debt, and then try to sell it as reform. There are better ideas, and I have put forward mine. I ask all senators to join me in co-sponsoring the State Health Care Choice Act. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we have all watched in awe during the past weeks as the unquenchable desire for liberty and human dignity have inspired the people of the Middle East to lift themselves up from oppression and move their country towards a new dawn. Sadly, we now also watch in horror the brutality of Colonel Gaddafi, who murders his own people as he clings to power. I join President Obama in calling for Colonel Gaddafi to leave Libya immediately and support our efforts in concert with the international community to help the Libyan people. What happens next, Mr. President? No one really knows, and I certainly do not have the answer. I pray that peace and stability come quickly to Libya and hope that the people of Egypt and Tunisia make a swift and concrete progress in establishing democratic institutions and the rule of law. While each country in the region must find its own path in this journey, I would suggest that the international community currently has a process in place that could serve as a way forward for the countries in the Middle East and North Africa in establishing a more democratic process that guarantees free elections and free speech. I'm referring to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. The OSCE traces its origin to the signing of the Helsinki Accords in 1975, and for more than 35 years has helped bridge the chasm between Eastern and Western Europe and Central Asia by ensuring both military security for member countries and the inalienable human rights of its citizens. Mr. President, there are three baskets in OSCE. One basket deals with human rights, because it's critically important that the countries respect the rights of its citizens. Another basket deals with security, because you cannot have human rights unless you have a secured country that protects the security of its people. The third basket deals with economics and environment, because you cannot have a secure country and you cannot have human rights unless there's an economic opportunity for your citizens and you respect the environment in which we live in. The three baskets are brought together. In the United States, the Congress passed a U.S. Helsinki Commission that monitors and encourages compliance by the member states in the OSCE. I am privileged to serve as the Senate chairman of the U.S. Helsinki Commission, and I represent our commission on these issues. Today, Egypt and Tunisia, along with Algeria, Israel, Jordan, and Morocco, are active Mediterranean partners for cooperation within the OSCE and have made a commitment to work towards the principles of the organization. In 1975, the Helsinki Final Act recognized the security in Europe as closely linked with the security in the Mediterranean and created this special partnership between the signatory states and the countries in the Mediterranean as a way to improve relations and work towards peace in the region. Libya was an original partner in this endeavor, but regrettably and in my view to its detriment, ultimately turned its back on the organization. More recently, the U.S. Helsinki Commission has made the Mediterranean Partnership a priority on our agenda. In the Parliamentary Assembly meetings that take place in which all of the member states are present, including our partners, we've had sidebar events to encourage the strengthening of the relationship between our Mediterranean partners, for more cooperation, to deal with human rights issues, to deal with free and fair elections, to deal with their economic and environmental needs, including trade among the Mediterranean partners, and yes, to deal with the security issues, to make sure that the countries and the people that live there are safe. A Helsinki-like process for the Middle East could provide a pathway for establishing of human rights, peace, and stability in Egypt, Tunisia, and other countries in the Middle East. As a member of the U.S. Helsinki Commission since 1993, I have discussed the possibility of a Helsinki-like process for the region with Middle Eastern leaders, a process that could result in more open, democratic society with a free press and fair elections. The Helsinki process, now embodied in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, bases relations between countries on the core principles of security, cooperation, and respect for human rights. These principles are implemented by procedures that establish equality among all the member states through a consensus-based decision-making process, open dialogue, regular review of commitments, and engagement with civil society. We have seen the Helsinki process work before in a region that has gone through generations without personal freedom or human rights. Countries that have been repressed under the totalitarian regime of the Soviet Union are now global leaders in democracy, human rights, and freedom. One need only look as far as the thriving Baltic countries to see what the OSCE can help countries become leaders in their regions. Lithuania now chairs both the OSCE and the Community of Democracies. Estonia has joined the Unified European Common Currency, and Latvia has shown its commitment to shared values as a strong new member of the NATO alliance. Enshrined among the Helsinki Accord's 10 guiding principles is a commitment to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, including freedom of speech and peaceful assembly. The Helsinki process is committed to the full participation of civil society. These aspects of the Helsinki process, political dialogue and public participation, are critical in the Middle East, and we are watching these principles in action today in Egypt and Tunisia. The principles contained in the Helsinki Accords have proven their worth over 3 decades. These principles take on increasing importance as the people of the Middle East demand accountability from their leaders. Whether the countries of the region choose to create their own Conference for Security and Cooperation, or as some have suggested, the current OSCE Mediterranean partners and their neighbors seek full membership in the OSCE, I believe such an endeavor would offer a path for governments in the region to respect human rights, establish free press, and institute fair elections. Finally, as the citizens of both Tunisia and Egypt demand more freedom, I urge both countries to permit domestic and international observers to participate in any electoral process. The OSCE and its Parliamentary Assembly have extensive experience in assessing and monitoring elections and could serve as an impartial observer as both countries work to meet the demands of openness and freedom of their citizens. I might tell you that the election monitoring that takes place within the OSCE states is a common occurrence. During our midterm elections, there were OSCE observers here in the United States. So they are present in most of the OSCE states because we find this a helpful way to make sure that we are doing everything we can to have an open and fair election system. Free and fair elections are critical, but they must be built upon the strengthening of democratic institutions and the rule of law. I believe that the principles contained in the Helsinki Accords have a proven track record and could help guide this process. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to get back to the underlying patent legislation that we're debating, and especially to talk on a particular amendment. We're talking, of course, about the America Invents Act, legislation that would modernize our patent laws, legislation which I believe will have very strong support in this body as soon as we're able to bring our debate to a close and have a vote on it. But there is one amendment that would be very troublesome if adopted, and I want to speak to it today. It's offered by my good friend from California, Senator Feinstein. But it would strike the bill's first-to-file provisions. This would not be a good idea. In fact, it would be a very bad idea, and I'd like to describe why. First of all, this first-to-file, which is just the concept that the filing date of the patent dates to the time that you file it. It's not new. And the question is whether we would codify that. It's been a subject of debate now for about 20 years, but at this point it's been thoroughly explored by hearings before both the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. We considered this at the outset of the drafting of our patent reform legislation. It's been in every version of the bill that's been introduced since 2005. And importantly, this provision that we have in the bill that would be taken out by the proposed amendment is supported by all three of the major patent law organizations that represent all of the industries across the board. It's got the support of the American Bar Association's Intellectual Property Law section. It's supported by the Intellectual Property Owners, which is a trade group or association of companies which own patents and cuts across all industrial sectors. And very importantly, our language also has the support of independent inventors, many of whom have signed letters to the Senate in support of the codification of the first-to-file rule embedded in the Leahy bill. The bottom line, Mr. President, is there's a strong consensus to finally codify what's in practice everywhere else in the world, and namely that patents are dated by when they were filed, which obviously makes sense. Let me respond to just a couple of the arguments that have been raised in favor of the Feinstein Amendment. One argument is that the current first-to-invent system is better for the little guy, the small independent inventor. It turns out that's actually not only not true, but the opposite is the case. Under the first-to-invent system, if a big company tries to claim the same innovation that a small innovator made, then that innovator would prevail if he could prove that he actually invented first, even if he filed last. But to prove he invented first, the independent inventor would need to prevail in what's called an interference proceeding. Now, these interference proceedings before the Patent and Trade Office involve a determination by PTO of who actually invented first. And the PTO looks at all of the parties' notebooks and other documents to determine issues such as conception of the idea and reduction to practice, the elements of a workable patent. Yesterday, I quoted from commentary that was published on Sunday, February 27th, in other words, very recently, by Mr. Gene Quinn, who's a patent lawyer, writes for the IP Watchdog website. And I quoted his commentary noting that only one independent inventor has actually prevailed in an interference proceeding in the last 7 years. In other words, if the idea here is that we need to preserve something that's used by small inventors, by independent inventors, it just isn't the case that the first to invent actually does that. In his column, Mr. Quinn does a very good job of explaining why the interference proceeding is largely an illusory remedy for small or independent inventors. And I'm going to quote from what he said. Quote, "The independent inventors and small entities, those typically viewed as benefiting from the current first-to-invent system, realistically could never benefit from such a system. To prevail as the first-to-invent and second-to-file, you must prevail in an interference proceeding. And according to a 2005 data from the AIPLA, the average cost through an interference is over $600,000. So let's not kid ourselves," Mr. Quinn says. "The first-to-invent system cannot be used by independent inventors in any real, logical, or intellectually honest way, as supported by the reality of the numbers above. First-to-invent is largely a feel-good approach to patents where the underdog at least has a chance if they happen to have $600,000 in disposable income to invest on the crapshoot that is an interference proceeding, end of quote. Obviously, the parties that are likely to take advantage of a system that costs more than $500,000 to utilize are not likely to be small and independent inventors. Indeed, it is typically major corporations that invoke and prevail in interference proceedings. The very cost of the proceeding alone effectively ensures that it is these larger parties that can benefit from this system. In many cases, small inventors such as startups and universities simply cannot afford to participate in an interference, and they surrender their rights once a well-funded party starts such a proceeding. So I think that first argument is unassailable. With only one small inventor in the last 7 years having prevailed in such a proceeding, it doesn't seem that it's something that favors the small or independent inventor. Mr. Quinn's article also responded to critics who allege that the present bill eliminates the grace period for patent applications. The grace period is the one-year period prior to filing when the inventor may disclose his invention without giving up his right to patent. Mr. Quinn quotes the very language of the bill and draws the obvious conclusion, and let me quote from what he said. Regardless of the disinformation that is widespread, the currently proposed S-23 does in fact have a grace period. The grace period would be quite different than what we have now and would not extend to all third-party activities, but many of the horror stories say that if someone learns of your invention from you and beats you to the patent office, they'll get the patent. That is simply flat wrong, he notes. He, of course, is referring to the bill's proposed Section 102B. Under paragraph 1A of that section, disclosures made by the inventor or someone who got the information from the inventor less than a year before the application is filed do not count as prior art. And under paragraph 1B, during the one-year period before the application is filed, if the inventor publicly discloses his invention, no subsequently disclosed prior art, regardless of whether it's derived from the inventor, can count as prior art and invalidate the patent. This effectively creates a first-to-publish rule that protects those inventors who choose to disclose their invention. An inventor who publishes his invention or discloses it at a trade show or an academic conference, for example, or otherwise makes it publicly available, has an absolute right to priority if he files an application within 1 year of his disclosure. No application effectively filed after his disclosure and no prior art disclosed after his disclosure can defeat his application for the patent. These rules are highly protective of inventors, especially those who share their inventions with the interested public but still file a patent application within a year. These rules are also clear, objective, and transparent. And, Mr. President, that's what we're trying to achieve with this legislation, so that there is uniformity, there is clarity, it is much easier to defend what you have done. In effect, the rules under the legislation create unambiguous guidelines for inventors, and a return to the proposal of Senator Feinstein would obviously create the ambiguity that we're trying to get away from. Bottom line is, an inventor who wishes to keep his invention secret must file an application promptly before another person discloses the invention to the public or files a patent for it. And an inventor can also share his invention with others. If his activities make the invention publicly available, he has to file an application within a year, but his disclosure also prevents any subsequently disclosed prior art from taking away his right to the patent. The bill's proposed Section 102 also creates clear guidelines for those who practice in a technology to figure out if a patent is valid against prior art. For example, all a manufacturer needs to do is look at the patent's filing date, figure out whether the inventor publicly disclosed the invention. If prior art is disclosed, the invention to the public before the filing date, or if the inventor disclosed the invention within a year of filing, but the prior art predates that disclosure, then the invention is invalid. And if not, the patent is valid against a prior art challenge. Now, some critics of the first-to-file system also argue that it will be expensive for inventors because they'll be forced to rush to file a completed application rather than being able to rely on their invention date and take their time to complete an application. But these critics ignore the possibility of filing a provisional application, which requires only a written description of the invention and how to make it. Once a provisional application is filed, The inventor has a year to file the completed application, and a provisional application only costs $220 for a large entity, only $110 for a small entity. So this is easily accomplished and quite affordable. In fact, one of Mr. Quinn's earlier columns on November 7th of 2009 effectively rebuts the notion that relying on invention dates offers inventors any substantial advantage over simply filing a provisional application. Here's what he says, quote, "If you rely on first to invent and are operating at all responsibly, you're keeping an invention notebook that will meet evidentiary burdens if and when it's necessary to demonstrate conception prior to the conception of the party who is first to file. Your invention notebook or invention record will detail, describe, identify, and date conception so that others skilled in the art will be able to look at the notebook record and understand what you did, what you knew, and come to believe that you did in fact appreciate what you had. If you have this, you have provable conception. If you have provable and identifiable conception, you also have a disclosure that informs and supports the invention. And if the notebook provably demonstrates conception, then it can be filed as a provisional patent application. In other words, what you would ordinarily have in any event can be used as the provisional application. In other words, the showing that an inventor must make in a provisional application is effectively the same showing that he would have to make to prove his invention date under the first to invent system. A small inventor operating under first to invent rules already must keep independently validated notebooks that show when he conceived of his invention. Under first to file rules, the only additional steps that the same inventor must take are writing down the same things that his notebooks are supposed to prove, filing that writing with the patent office, and paying a $110 fee. Once the possibility of filing a provisional application is considered, along with the bill's enhanced grace period, it should be clear that the first to file system will not be at all onerous for small inventors. And once one considers the bill's clean, clear rules for prior art and priority dates, its elimination of subjective elements in patent law, its new proceeding to correct patents, and its elimination of current patent forfeiture pitfalls that trap legally unwary inventors, it is clear that this bill will benefit inventors, both large and small. So, Mr. President, because this issue has been considered from the inception of the debate about the legislation, in all of the testimony and markups in every version of the bill since 2005, is supported by all of the industry groups that believe that patent reform is necessary, conforms to the rules of all other countries in the world, and provides clear and easily demonstrable evidence of your patent. We believe that the first to file rule is the best rule. Date it from the date you filed your patent, rather than this rather confusing notion of the first to invent, which has not worked especially well, and certainly has not worked well for the small inventor, which is the point, I gather, of the amendment proposed by Senator Feinstein. I would just urge my colleagues, if there are questions or confusions about this, those of us who are involved in this would be happy to try to answer them, be happy to be on the floor to discuss it further, but at such time as we have a vote on this, I would hope that my colleagues would go along with what the committee did and what all of the versions of the bill have written in the past, and support the bill as written and not approve this amendment.
Mr. President.